a terrible injury. And there Charles Krauthammer lay in a hospital bed, paralyzed. Nothing to do but think.
I made one promise to myself on day one. I was not going to allow it to alter my life, except in ways which are sort of having to do with gravity. I'm not going to defy gravity, and I'm not going to walk, I'm not going to water ski again, that's fine. So that you know. But on the big things in life, the direction of my life, what I was going to do, that wouldn't change at all.
Krauthammer says he never entertained the notion that one day, whether through his own effort or even some medical miracle, he'd regain full use of his arms and legs. He resigned himself to the cold reality that wherever he went in life, he'd go in a wheelchair. Is that hard?
I think the physical part was hard, learning to do everything again. I have a great capacity for erasing memories, so it seems very short. It was long, but it would seem very short.
His teachers and classmates certainly thought he was rushing his decision to resume his studies immediately. You never thought about taking a year off or taking a couple years off?
No. I knew that would be fatal. It was not a question.
Because you just couldn't survive?
Yeah, I mean, life would be over. It's a little early for life to be over.
So while nobody had heard of someone with Krauthammer's injury standing up to the rigors of a med school curriculum, Krauthammer convinced Harvard to let him try. Amazingly, mere weeks after his accident, he resumed classes while still in his hospital bed.
I was lying on my back, couldn't move. The professors would come in, repeat their lectures, and project slides on the ceiling. Because I had asked the medical school to let me stay with my class.
And you read by laying on your back?
One of the cardiac residents hooked up a plexiglass plate above my head that he hung from the posters of the bed, and the nurses would put a book on it face down. Now, you don't want to call them every 3 minutes and a half to turn the page, so I put 2 books up at once, so they'd only have to come half the time. But you got to remember where you were. It's a bit of a challenge. It keeps you busy. There wasn't a lot else to do.
With such force of will, Krauthammer graduated on time in 1975 and near the top of his class. Along the way, he got the girl, too, and married Robin. But as he began his 3-year residency at Massachusetts General Hospital, there were indications from the beginning that Charles and psychiatry might not be the perfect fit. Part of the residency is that you're supposed to go to this weekly group therapy session, and you didn't want to go.
There were 12 of us residents in Mass General, and there was a group therapy once a week. And I didn't go. I thought it's a pointless exercise. So I was called into the chief's office after about 7 weeks of non-appearance, and he said to me, why aren't you going to therapy? And I said, sir, I came here to give therapy, not to receive it. And he said to me, you're in denial. And I said, of course I'm in denial. Denial is the greatest of all defense mechanisms. I could be a professor of denial. I mean, I'm an expert at, but I was going on, and he wasn't very amused.
He gave Krauthammer an ultimatum: go to group therapy or leave the program.
So I went to the next 21 weeks of sessions or whatever it was. But I didn't really say a word. So whenever people would notice that, they'd say, why aren't you talking? I said, because I'm in denial. I'm not a big therapy guy.
But was it because you didn't want somebody looking around your head?
Yes. I don't like to talk about myself, except with you, I guess. I'm not a touchy, I'm not a feely guy. And that's probably why I quit psychiatry. I mean, if you're not into feelings and emotions and all the backstory, then you ought to be doing something else.
So in 1978, Krauthammer took a government job in Washington at what would become the National Institute of Mental Health. It wasn't what he really wanted, but it put him in the right neighborhood.
I thought, once I'm in Washington, isn't that where they do politics? One thing will lead to another.
His folks worried about their son tossing away a doctor's livelihood, but didn't discourage him. His wife, Robin, who would leave her career in law to become a painter and sculptor, urged him to follow his dream.
She was the one who 35 years ago encouraged me to follow my heart, and with her wit and humor and generosity of spirit has co-authored my life.
In a moment, Charles' co-author helps him answer a higher calling. And later, he finds himself moving left to right after the break. Charles Krauthammer once wrote a column about the most important person of the 20th century. Time magazine had chosen Einstein, the great scientist. Charles disagreed. He picked Churchill, the indispensable statesman who led the fight against Hitler and sounded the alarm over communism. Politics trumping science. That might explain why Krauthammer traded a big-time medical career for a one-way ticket to Washington. And why, once here, his eyes locked onto a help-wanted ad in the political opinion magazine, The New Republic.
I showed it to my wife, and she said, "Why don't you apply?" I said, "Well, how can I apply? I've never written anything, don't know anybody." She said, "You write it, I'll hand deliver it." That day at my office at the NIMH, I get a call. "Hi, I'm Mike Kinsley, editor of The New Republic. I just got your letter. Why do you want to do this? You're a doctor."
I was intrigued, so I called him.
Michael Kinsley was looking for a managing editor for the left-leaning magazine.
Was there something in his application, something during that phone call that made you want to bring him down?
It was mainly the fact that he was a psychiatrist, because he had no writing samples, you know. So we arranged for him to come to lunch, and you know, there he was in his wheelchair, and we hit it off right away.
Well, what did you see in him, though?
You know, I just enjoyed talking to him so much. I had this feeling he must be able to write this down.
Krauthammer gave it a shot. As the saying goes, he wrote about what he knew. His first article, The Expanding Shrink, protested how psychoanalysis was creeping into political discourse. For example, President Carter's famous malaise speech that blamed the horrible economy on Americans' crisis of confidence.
They liked it, that they published it, and I got lucky again. It was republished on the op-ed page of the Washington Post. It was the first time any article in the New Republic had been picked up by the Post.
Krauthammer wrote a few more pieces for the magazine and might have joined the staff, except he got an even more intriguing offer as a speechwriter for Vice President Walter Mondale.
That lasted 6 months. And when we got totally crushed in the general election, I got a call from the New Republic, and they said, "We think you're unemployed now. Would you like to come work for us?" I said yes right away and started. On the day Reagan was sworn in, that's the first day I started at the New Republic as a writer.
So help me God.
The new president was promising big changes, even starting the world anew. Reagan's inaugural truly signaled a great clash of ideas.
In this present crisis, government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem.
And the New Republic was right in the midst of it.
Well, it was overwhelmingly liberal. The writers were the best of that era. I was still a Democrat at the time, a traditional liberal Democrat, a great society liberal, but I was pretty hardline on the Soviets. It's hard for people to believe now, but the Democratic Party had a very powerful wing that was very anti-Soviet.
But those Democrats were a dying breed, and Krauthammer found himself agreeing more with President Reagan than with his liberal readers.
I ended up supporting just about every element of the Reagan foreign policy, and boy, did we get reaction from our liberal readership. I wrote one editorial excoriating the nuclear freeze that caused the largest number of cancelled subscriptions in the history of the magazine, which I was very proud of.
What was his writing like?
It's always been extremely step-by-step logical. If you can read a column by Charles about something and you can still disagree with him after you're through with it, then you know you must have a pretty good argument.
Those arguments had conservative columnists like William F. Buckley wondering why Krauthammer and the New Republic were not supporting Reagan's re-election in 1984.
What Buckley was writing was, why don't you give up on the Democrats? And I was still one of those who wanted to sort of save the soul of the Democratic Party and maintain this conservative element of which the magazine really was.
Krauthammer fired off a letter to Buckley, writing, Reagan still had, quote, a lot to answer for on foreign policy, and his domestic policy was far worse. Quote, the catalog of sins we believe the president has committed is too long to recapitulate here. But Krauthammer tells me he privately wanted Reagan to beat his old boss, Walter Mondale.
But I had worked for Mondale in 1980. I liked him and had respect for him. And as a personal matter, as a kind of a matter of honor, I didn't want to vote against a man for whom I had respect and affection.
So you have a vote, Reagan or Mondale?
That's the only presidential election where I left that line blank.
Left it blank.
But if I had been the swing vote, I would have obviously have voted for Reagan.
It was a turning point in Krauthammer's transition from the political left to the political right.
And just a few months after the election, I wrote something called the Reagan Doctrine.
It was a Time magazine column, and it was provocative. For while Krauthammer had praised Reagan on a number of foreign policy issues, he was now crediting him with a breakthrough insight that changed the calculus of the Cold War.
I realized that what Reagan had done without a grand master plan was to challenge what at the time was called the Brezhnev Doctrine. And that was whenever we take over a country, it becomes a communist, it's ours. And all of a sudden what Reagan had done is to challenge that and to say, no, you don't get to keep what you got. We're going to challenge your possessions, wherever they are. And I thought, this is a really good idea. And I'm going to give it a name.
He invented the Reagan Doctrine, not Reagan. And now everybody's got to have a doctrine.
Yeah.
Charles has made it mandatory to come up with a doctrine for every president.
But even after Reagan's 49-state landslide, Krauthammer was still not sure what to make of Reagan the man, who he met at the White House in 1986.
He invited me to lunch. I tried to engage him, like on the conscious, what are you going to do? And all of a sudden, what I'm hearing from him is a story about how when he and Nancy were in the guest house of President Marcos of the Philippines, there was a giant spider on the ceiling. And the question was how to get him off without scaring Nancy. And I'm thinking, I don't get it. This is the most successful president in my lifetime. He seems to be out to lunch. What's going on?
He says it was only later that he realized what eluded him about Reagan.
He had no need ever to show how smart he was. He knew exactly what I was asking. He didn't want to talk about it. And if you thought he was a dunce, he didn't care because he knew that he wasn't.
It would also be some time before Krauthammer embraced a conservative domestic policy, taxes, welfare, small government, and other Reagan-esque sins.
It took me about a decade. I was skeptical of tax cuts. I was skeptical of smaller government at the beginning. And then by the end of the 80s, I had begun to change.
What happened?
Empirical evidence. As a doctor, I'd been trained in empirical evidence. I mean, if the treatment is killing your patients, you stop the treatment. And I began to look and to read and to think about whether the view I had of a social democratic society like they had in Europe was the right way. And I sort of, I moved gradually to the idea of a more limited society, smaller government.
By that time, Krauthammer's world was really falling into place. In 1985, his son, Daniel, was born. 2 years later, Krauthammer won the biggest honor in print journalism, the Pulitzer Prize. Not bad for someone who started in the business less than a decade earlier, without even a writing sample. He went straight from the ceremony to see his father, who'd once worried about his son's jump from medicine to journalism. Shulam Krauthammer was 84 and gravely ill.
I went to the hospital where he was, and I said, Dad, I have something I want to give you. And I gave him the medal. And he beamed, and he showed it to all the nurses.
It turned out to be Krauthammer's final visit with his dad.
So the last time I saw him was a time when this whole circle was closed, and he could feel that the choice had been redeemed in some way. It was a very comforting thing to remember about the last time you see your parent.
Krauthammer called the 1990s a holiday from history. The Cold War was won. The era of big government declared over. And 9/11 brought a new urgency to his commentary.
People understand there is a nexus between these weapons, these states, and the terrorists, and we have to attack them where they are.
Krauthammer began